That night, I joked. I told myself it wasn't really a joke, but I didn't have the nerve to call it real either, so I let it sit somewhere in between, the way you let a thing hang in the air when you're not ready to know what it means. I looked at Mara and said, "Come with me for a week." I climbed into bed, turned off the light, and figured I'd wake up alone the way I always did, the way I had every morning for 2 years. But at 5 in the morning, when I stepped outside and the dew hadn't burned off the grass yet, I saw her standing beside the rig, pulling that small bronze suitcase behind her, looking straight at me like she'd been standing there longer than I knew. She whispered, "I'm ready." I didn't know what to say. My name is Luke Harmon. I'm 31 years old, and I drive long haul out of Knoxville, Tennessee, west toward Memphis, over to Little Rock, and up through Nashville before I loop back home. It wasn't the job I planned on when I was younger, and if you'd told me 10 years ago I'd end up here, I probably would have laughed the way Mara laughed that night. Easy, not quite believing it. But after a couple of years behind the wheel, it became the only thing that still felt familiar to me, the hum of the engine underneath everything, the white lines disappearing under the hood mile after mile, a kind of quiet that never asked anything of me and never expected me to be anyone other than exactly who I was. Before the truck, I ran logistics operations for a freight company out of Nashville. I had a desk with my name on a little plastic plaque, a title, a handful of people who reported to me and asked me questions I mostly knew the answers to. Then the company restructured, the way companies do when the numbers stop adding up, the way somebody upstairs wants them to, and my whole department got folded into someone else's spreadsheet almost overnight. 2.5 years ago, I traded an office chair for a driver's seat, and I won't pretend that transition didn't sting for a good long while. But somewhere around the 2nd year, I stopped missing the version of myself who used to sit in conference rooms, and I started liking the version who just drove, who measured his days and exits and rest stops instead of quarterly reports. My marriage ended around the same stretch of time, though I don't think the two things happened for the same reason, even if they're tangled together in my memory now. Diane and I had been married 4 years, and when the job changed, the shape of our life changed with it. Less money coming in, more nights spent somewhere on a highway instead of at home, and even on the nights I was standing in our kitchen, some part of me had already checked out toward the next run. Neither of us did anything wrong, not really. We just slowly stopped being the two people who'd stood up in front of family and made promises to each other. 2 years ago we signed the papers at a lawyer's office that smelled like burnt coffee, and I moved out to a farmhouse on the edge of town, alone, no kids, no plans to change any of that anytime soon. The farmhouse has a gravel yard wide enough to park an 18-wheeler in without asking anybody's permission, and if I'm honest, that's the entire reason I bought the place. 3 bedrooms, and I use 1. I keep the other 2 clean because I don't know what else to do with them. Vacuumed floors and made beds nobody sleeps in, closets holding nothing but hangers. Some nights I walk past the 2nd door on my way to bed and think about buying furniture for it, filling it with something, and then I don't. And the thought just sits there quietly and waits for another year to pass. I met Mara the way you meet most people in a town this size, which is to say I honestly couldn't tell you the exact first conversation we had. There's a gas station convenience store about 2 miles from my place, the kind with a coffee machine that's older than both of us and a bell over the door that never quite closes right, and she used to come in around 6 in the morning for a black coffee, hair pulled back loosely, dressed like someone who'd either just walked a long way or hadn't slept enough the night before. She didn't talk much. Neither did I. Most mornings. But somewhere in all those quiet stretches standing near the register, we started talking anyway. Small things at first. The weather, road conditions out past the county line, nothing that seemed to matter until, somehow, without my noticing exactly when, all of it did. The first time I ever saw that bronze suitcase, it wasn't at my place at all. It was through the window of the room she rented in town, on a night I happened to be walking past after dropping a friend's truck off for repairs a few blocks over. It sat in the corner of her room, wheels still dusted from some road I didn't know a thing about, like she'd never fully unpacked it, like some part of her was always half ready to leave again. I don't know why I noticed it that night, but I did, and I kept noticing it long after. Every single time I happened to see her carrying it anywhere at all. Those mornings at the gas station eventually turned into her stopping by the farmhouse on days I was out on a run, watering the 2 plants I keep alive out of stubbornness more than any actual skill with plants, leaving a note on the kitchen counter that said things like, "Still alive, you're welcome." In handwriting, I started to recognize long before I ever admitted, even to myself, that I was looking for it every time I walked in the door. I never asked her to do any of that. She never asked if she should. It just started happening, the way certain things do when nobody in the room wants to be the one who names it out loud. I noticed, somewhere in all of that she knew my route better than most people who'd actually ridden along with me a few times. She knew which Tuesdays I left before sunrise, and which ones I didn't pull out until noon. I never once told her my schedule outright, never sat her down and walked her through it. She just knew, the way you know something you've been paying close attention to for far longer than you're willing to say out loud to anyone, including yourself. There was a stretch of about 9 months where nothing happened between us and, somehow, everything did at the same time. She'd mention, almost in passing, that she used to take pictures for a living. Food mostly, restaurants, and farmers markets. Back when she still lived in Nashville, and then she'd changed the subject before I ever got the chance to ask why she'd stopped doing it. I let her change it every time. I figured, whatever the reason was, it wasn't mine to go pulling out of her before she was ready to hand it over on her own terms, in her own time. I'd heard, secondhand, the way you hear most things in a town this size, that she'd been with somebody named Derek for a while, a floor manager over at one of the restaurant chains downtown, and that it hadn't ended well between them. I never asked her about it directly, not once. I figured if she wanted me to know the details, she'd tell me herself. 10 months before that morning with the suitcase, she did leave him, though I only pieced that timeline together much later, the way you piece together most of the things that really matter, backward, after they've already quietly happened around you. So when I made that joke, "Come with me for a week," it wasn't really about the road at all, even if that's what it sounded like. I'd been getting ready for a run down through Memphis, over to Little Rock, back up through Nashville, 7 days total, something I did 4 or 5 times a year without giving it much thought. I said it the way you say things you don't expect anyone to actually take seriously, half a smile already turning away toward the tire pressure gauge in my hand. She laughed. I laughed. I went to bed that night thinking that was the end of it, a joke told and forgotten by morning. It wasn't the end of it, and by the time I understood how long she'd actually been waiting for someone to ask her something like that, seriously or not, a whole lot of other things had already quietly fallen into place around the two of us, the way water finds a crack in something long before you ever see it happen. The first day on the road, neither of us said very much. Mara slept for maybe 45 minutes, then woke up and just watched the window, Tennessee turning into a long green blur before flattening out somewhere toward Memphis. I drove, both hands loose on the wheel, and I didn't ask her what she was thinking about, even though I wanted to. Somehow her just being there, quiet, not needing me to fill every silence with something, felt like enough on its own, more than enough. Somewhere past Jackson, she pulled her knees up onto the seat and said, without much of a lead-in, that she hadn't planned any of this, not the trip, not really anything since she'd left Nashville over a year earlier. She said it almost like a confession, like she expected a follow-up question I never asked her. I just nodded and kept my eyes on the road ahead. If she wanted to explain further, she would in her own time. I wasn't going to make her. That first night we stopped just outside Memphis at a motel that smelled like carpet cleaner and coming rain, and I remember standing near the truck afterward, checking the straps on the trailer more out of habit than any real necessity, and glancing back to see her carrying that same bronze suitcase up the outdoor stairs to her room. I hadn't thought, until that exact moment, about where that suitcase had actually been for the past 10 months, whether she'd carried it out of an apartment in Nashville or out of somewhere else entirely that I knew nothing about. I just watched her pull it behind her, wheels catching on the concrete, and felt something settle low in my chest that I didn't have a name for yet. The second day settled into something quieter than the first, less like two strangers sharing a cab and more like two people who'd already agreed, without ever saying it, not to rush anything. We stopped for gas somewhere past the Arkansas line, and while I filled the tank, she wandered off toward a row of sunflowers growing wild along the fence behind the station, phone out, taking pictures of nothing anyone would call important. The light, the angle, the way the pedals bent toward the road. I stood there watching her for longer than I needed to, and when she caught me looking, she didn't look away first. Neither did I. On the third day, somewhere between Little Rock and the interstate curving back north, she brought up Derek on her own, completely unprompted, the way people do when something's been sitting under the surface for far too long. She said, "Derek's not a bad person. He just never learned how to be with someone who didn't need managing." Then she looked out the window and didn't say anything else for a long while. I kept both hands steady on the wheel and didn't push her at all. I figured she'd said exactly as much as she meant to say in that moment, and anything I added on top of it would only make her feel like she owed me the rest of the story. I didn't ask her what she meant by managing. I had a guess, and the guess made something tighten quietly in my jaw that I didn't let show on my face. But it wasn't my place to go digging into it on a 2-lane highway doing 70 miles an hour with nowhere for either of us to go. So I let it sit there between us on the bench seat, the way most true things sit for a good while before anyone's actually ready to pick them back up. By the fourth day, we'd fallen into something like an easy rhythm together. She'd hand me a coffee from the thermos without me ever having to ask for it. I'd pull off at the same diner outside Conway every single run because the pie there was good, and the waitress remembered my order by heart, and this time Mara came inside with me instead of waiting out in the cab the way she'd done the first couple of stops. She sat across from me in a cracked vinyl booth, and for the first time in longer than I could honestly remember, the inside of that truck felt less like a place I simply lived in and more like a place we were passing through together, side by side. That same evening, somewhere on the radio, an old country song came on that I hadn't heard in years, and without really thinking about it, Mara started singing along under her breath, quiet, not performing for anyone, just letting the words come out because they wanted to. I didn't join in. I don't have the voice for it. But I turned the volume up half a notch and let her have the moment, and for a few miles neither of us said anything at all, because nothing needed saying over a song like that. On the fifth day, at a small diner just outside Little Rock, I watched her turn a bowl of soup a quarter turn, tilt the window curtain back a couple of inches to catch better light, and take a picture of it on her phone before she ever once picked up a spoon to eat. I asked her how long she'd been doing that. She said, "Since Nashville, I stopped for a while." I didn't ask her why she'd stopped. I think I already understood, the same quiet way I'd understood the thing about Derek without her ever spelling it out for me. Some people stop doing the things they love most because someone else made loving anything at all feel like too great a risk to take. I watched her more closely after that afternoon, not in a way I think she ever noticed, but in the way you watch someone once you finally understand there's a lot more going on underneath than they're letting show on the surface. She'd photograph a plate of eggs at some truck stop, the same careful, deliberate way she must have once photographed something that mattered a great deal to a magazine or a paying client, precise, patient, like the old habit had never fully left her even after she'd tried her best to set it down for good. That bronze suitcase rode behind the cab the entire 7 days, strapped in tight next to my gear, and every single time I caught sight of it in the rearview mirror, I found myself circling back to a question I hadn't worked up the nerve to actually ask her out loud. Not why she'd come along, because I think I understood that part clearly enough by the third day. What I couldn't quite figure out was whether she planned on staying once the 7 days ran out and the road finally brought us back home. By the 6th day, somewhere on the long stretch back up through Nashville, I caught myself not wanting the trip to end at all, which honestly surprised me more than it probably should have. I'd made this exact same run a dozen times over the years and never once thought about the drive home with anything but plain relief at getting back. This time, watching the exit signs slowly count down toward Knoxville, one after another, I felt something a lot closer to dread settling into my stomach. I tried to figure out why, exactly, somewhere around mile marker 200, and the closest I could get was this. For 7 days I hadn't had to guess at anything. I knew where she was, what she was thinking about most of the time, whether she was hungry or tired or just quiet because the road makes people quiet. Once we got back, all of that guessing would start again, the way it always had before, and some part of me wasn't ready to go back to not knowing. Somewhere in there, I asked her why food photography, out of everything she could have chosen back in Nashville. She thought about it for a while before answering, watching the road instead of me. Because for 1 second, right before someone eats something, it's perfect, she said. Nobody's touched it yet. Nobody's decided if they like it. It just is what it is. I didn't say anything back right away. I've thought about that answer more times since than I probably should admit, turning it over the way you turn over something somebody says that ends up meaning more than they intended. On the 7th day, I pulled the rig back into the gravel yard at the farmhouse a little after 5 in the evening, the same hour I'd left almost exactly a week earlier, only the light hit everything differently now. Longer shadows stretching out across the yard, softer edges on every fence post and tree line. Mara climbed down from the cab, pulled her suitcase out from behind the seat, and stood there for a second like she wasn't quite sure what came next. Neither was I, if I'm being honest with myself. I didn't ask her to stay. She didn't offer to. She just said thank you for the ride. And I drove her back into town, and that was that, at least for a little while longer. 3 weeks after we got back, I stopped at the gas station on my way out for a Tuesday run, same as always, and Derek was standing near the pumps like he'd been waiting for somebody, though I doubt he'd actually been waiting for me specifically that morning. He knew exactly who I was before I ever said a single word, which told me Mara's name had come up somewhere between the two of them more recently than I really wanted to sit and think about. He wasn't loud about any of it, and that's honestly what made it harder to shake off afterward. He talked the way somebody talks when they've clearly rehearsed sounding reasonable, calm, almost kind about it, like he genuinely believed he was doing me some kind of favor by warning me ahead of time. He said, "I just think you should know. She texted me before she left with you. Mara does that sometimes, when she needs an excuse to get away from me for a while. You're not where she's actually headed. You're just the reason she gave herself to leave." I studied him for a second while he talked. The pressed collar, the calm hands, the way he leaned against the pump like this, was just another ordinary conversation between two reasonable men. I'd never actually met Derek before that morning, only heard his name attached to things secondhand, and standing there, I understood for the first time why somebody might mistake him for harmless. He didn't look like a man who needed to raise his voice to get what he wanted. That, more than anything, he said, was what stayed with me the rest of that day. He finished by saying he wasn't trying to cause trouble, that he just thought I deserved to know what I was walking into. I almost believed that part, standing there in the morning light with cars pulling in and out around us like nothing important was happening at all. It's strange how ordinary a moment can look from the outside while it's quietly rearranging something on the inside. I didn't answer him at all. I walked inside, got my coffee, paid at the counter, and headed back out to the truck without another word. But when I finally pulled out of that lot, I didn't turn toward the farmhouse the way I usually would. I drove straight up the highway with no real destination in mind for the better part of 40 minutes, windows down, radio on and then off and then on again, trying to find some version of the past 7 days that didn't have a crack running straight through the middle of it. What bothered me most wasn't that I believed Derek outright, because I didn't. Not entirely. It was that I didn't have a clean, easy way to not believe him either. He hadn't accused her of anything wild or dramatic. He'd simply handed me one small, specific fact, that she'd texted him before the trip, and quietly let my own imagination build the rest of the house around it, brick by brick. I kept turning it over and over on that drive, trying to decide whether trusting Mara was something I'd actually earned the right to do by now, or something I was just hoping my way blindly into. I thought about the diner outside Little Rock, the way she'd brought up Derek herself without me ever having to push her toward it. I thought about that suitcase riding behind the cab for 7 straight days, dust on the wheels from some road I never once asked her about. None of it added up cleanly to what Derek had said standing near those pumps, and none of it cleanly disproved it either. I hate that particular kind of not knowing more than almost anything else in the world. Give me a bad answer, flat out, and I can work with it, do something with it. Give me a maybe, and I'll circle it in my head for weeks without landing anywhere. I kept thinking, too, about how a person like Derek gets to walk up to a gas pump and hand somebody else's whole story to a stranger like it's his to give away. He'd never once asked me how I felt about any of it. He didn't need to. He just needed me doubting. And doubting is a lot easier to plant in somebody than it is to pull back out once it's taken root. I finally pulled off at an overlook I sometimes stop at when I need a minute. Gravel shoulder, a view of the valley going gray at the edges as the sun dropped. I sat there with the engine off, hands still on the wheel out of habit, and thought about how easy it would be to just let this become the reason I stopped answering her texts altogether. No explanation required, the kind of quiet ending that doesn't ask anyone to admit anything. It would have been easier. It also would have been a lie, and some part of me still cared enough not to tell one, even to myself. I didn't call Mara that night. I told myself I was giving both of us some space to think things through properly, but if I'm honest, I was really giving myself space to decide how much of this I was even willing to feel before I let her see any of it written on my face. I went back to the farmhouse, parked the rig in its usual spot, and sat out on the porch steps until it got too dark to see the tree line anymore, running Derek's voice through my head over and over, hunting for the seam where it finally stopped sounding true. For the next several weeks, I kept my distance without ever quite deciding to do it on purpose. I didn't answer her texts as fast as I used to. I found reasons to take an extra run instead of coming home a day early like I normally would have. I told myself I wasn't punishing her for anything, that I was simply being careful. But careful had quietly started to look a whole lot like retreat, and some part of me knew exactly what I was doing, even while I was doing it. It's an old habit of mine, pulling back before somebody else gets the chance to do it to me first. I've been doing it since Diane, honestly, and maybe even longer than that. One evening she stopped by the farmhouse with a container of something she'd cooked, some excuse about having made too much, and I stood in the doorway thanking her without inviting her in the way I usually. I watched something flicker across her face. Not hurt exactly, more like recognition. Like she'd seen this particular version of me somewhere before and knew better than to push against it. She left the container on the counter and drove off, and I stood in that kitchen a long time afterward, angry at myself in a way I couldn't quite explain. I ate that food alone at the kitchen table 2 nights in a row before I could bring myself to admit what I already knew, that keeping my distance wasn't protecting anything. It was just delaying a conversation I was going to have eventually, one way or another, whether I felt ready for it or not. Mara noticed before I ever said a single word about any of it. She's always been better at reading silence than I've ever been at hiding it from her. She didn't push, didn't come right out and ask what was wrong between us. She just watched me the same way she watches most everything, carefully, patiently. Like she was waiting for whatever this was to surface on its own instead of being dragged out of me before I was ready to hand it over. She showed up at the farmhouse on a Sunday afternoon, about a month after Derek had cornered me near those gas pumps. I heard tires on gravel and figured it was a delivery, but when I looked out the front window, it was her car, parked at an angle like she hadn't fully committed to staying long. She didn't knock on the door. When I stepped outside, she was already sitting on the porch steps, elbows resting on her knees, looking out at nothing in particular across the yard. She'd clearly been sitting there a while before I noticed her, long enough for the sun to shift a few degrees behind the barn, long enough that I wondered how many times over the past month she'd driven partway out here and turned around before reaching the driveway. I didn't ask her that. Some things you can just see on a person without needing them confirmed out loud, the particular stillness of somebody who's finally stopped turning around. I sat down next to her without saying a word. For a minute or two, neither of us talked at all. The quiet between us didn't feel heavy the way it had inside my own head for weeks. It felt more like the kind of quiet that's actually getting ready to be filled with something real. She spoke first, finally. "I know what Derek told you," she said. "Somebody mentioned it to me. I did text him before I left with you. That part's true, and I won't pretend otherwise." She turned to look at me directly. "But I texted him to tell him not to reach out to me anymore. I did that before I ever asked you if I could come along on that run. I don't know if you understand the difference between those two things, but I need you to." I understood it. I think some part of me had already understood it underneath all the driving and the not calling and the 40 empty minutes on that highway. I just hadn't let myself fully trust it until right then. I told her that. I told her it took about 20 seconds, sitting right there on those wooden steps beside her, to finally let myself believe I was allowed to understand it without doubting every word. She let out a breath then, small, like she'd been holding it since she pulled into the driveway. I noticed her hands had been gripping her own knees the whole time she talked, knuckles a little pale, and only now did they loosen. I hadn't realized how much this had cost her to say until I watched her body finally let go of it. She kept going, like she needed to finish the thought all the way through before either of us moved an inch. "I got on your truck because I wanted to get on your truck," she said, plainly. "Not because I was running away from him. Not because I needed some excuse to disappear for a week. That's the whole reason, start to finish. I don't need another one, and I'm not going to invent one just to make it sound better." I didn't say anything clever back to her. I don't think the moment called for anything clever at all. I just looked at her, and past her shoulder, through the porch railing, I could see her car parked out in the yard, and in the back seat, that same bronze suitcase, sitting upright like it had somewhere important to be. It wasn't sitting in a rented room anymore, dusty in some corner. It wasn't strapped down behind a cab. It was just there, with her, wherever she happened to go next. After a while, I stood up, went inside, and put the kettle on the stove. I made 2 cups of coffee, which doesn't sound like much of anything when I say it out loud, but I hadn't actually made coffee for 2 people in that kitchen since Diane left, and some habits carry a lot more weight than they look like they should from the outside. I carried the 2 cups back out and set them down on the step between us, and Mara looked at them for a second before she picked one up, like she understood exactly what I hadn't managed to say out loud yet. We didn't talk about what came next that particular afternoon. We didn't need to, not right then. The late sun came in low across the yard, warm against the wood underneath us, and somewhere past the tree line a truck downshifted out on the highway, and neither of us moved to fill the silence with anything more than what it already held. It had already been filled with more than enough for one day. Before she left that evening, she stood by her car for a moment, one hand on the door handle, and looked back at the house like she was memorizing it. The porch light just starting to flicker on against the dusk, the gravel yard, the truck parked in its usual spot. I stood in the doorway and watched her go. And for the first time since Derek had said his piece at the gas station, the quiet between us felt like something we'd built on purpose, instead of something either of us was hiding inside. 2 weeks after that afternoon on the porch, Mara started stopping by in the mornings again, same as she always had before any of this got complicated between us. The only real difference was small, but I noticed it right away without her ever pointing it out. She knew exactly which cabinet held the coffee without having to ask me first. She reached past 2 other shelves and found it on the very first try, and I didn't ask her how long she'd actually known that. Some questions don't need answering out loud to matter. She started taking pictures again, actually taking them properly, not just glancing at a plate for a second before pushing it aside like it didn't count. She photographed the light coming through the kitchen window most mornings, the gravel yard glistening after a hard rain, the truck parked at an angle out front with the sun sitting low behind it. She never once asked my opinion on any of the pictures she took. She just left them printed and pinned up along the hallway wall one week while I was out on a long run, and when I came back and saw them hanging there, I didn't ask her why she'd done it. I just stood in that hallway a lot longer than I strictly needed to. We didn't put a name on any of it right away, not for a while. We just kept doing the same things we'd already been doing. Her stopping by most mornings, me heading out on runs and coming back home, both of us slowly circling something neither of us wanted to rush or push too hard. I'd catch her humming quietly in the kitchen some mornings, like she didn't realize I could hear her from the hallway. I never told her I noticed. I liked having something that was just quietly mine to notice, without either of us saying it out loud. Some evenings, when I got back late from a run, I'd find the porch light already on, even though I never asked her to leave it that way, and I started to understand that was just something she did now, without needing to be told, the same way I'd started leaving an extra mug out on the counter before I ever admitted to myself why. Neither of us called any of this a routine. It just quietly became one, the way most good things do, without an announcement. Around 6 months after that afternoon on the porch, she pulled into the gravel yard with her car packed a little tighter than usual, boxes stacked in the back seat, and that bronze suitcase riding up front where she could keep an eye on it the whole drive over. I came out to help her carry things inside, and when I reached for the suitcase, she let me take it without a single word, which felt like its own kind of sentence passing quietly between us. I carried it through the front door and past the hallway where her photograph still hung pinned to the wall, and I set it down outside the second bedroom, the one I'd kept clean and empty for 2 full years, without ever once deciding what it was actually for. She stood in the doorway and looked at it for a moment. I said, "Second room's got a closet." She said, "I know." Neither one of us said anything else after that. We didn't need to. We spent the rest of that afternoon carrying boxes in from her car, her camera equipment stacked carefully in one corner. A handful of framed pictures I recognized from her old rented room, now finding new walls to hang on. By the time the sun went down, the house didn't look like mine with someone visiting anymore. It looked like ours, in a way that had nothing to do with paperwork and everything to do with where things had ended up sitting. Somewhere in the weeks that followed, I stopped noticing the suitcase as a separate thing entirely. It went into that closet, and it stayed there, and the sight of it stopped meaning arrival, because there was nothing left for it to arrive at anymore. It had already gotten exactly where it was going, and both of us knew it. The next long run we took together, she came along for the whole week without me needing to ask her twice. Camera bag slung over one shoulder, thermos steady in the other hand. I didn't ask her what she was planning on photographing this time around. I'd stopped needing to know in advance. Somewhere past Jackson, I caught her taking a picture of the road itself, just the white lines running out ahead of us under a gray morning sky, and I didn't say a word about it. Some things you learn to let a person keep entirely for themselves. That trip felt different from the first one, easier in a way that didn't need explaining. We stopped at the same diner outside Conway, out of habit now, and the waitress who'd once only known my order started bringing 2 coffees to the table before either of us asked. Small towns keep track of things like that, quietly, the same way I'd been keeping track of Mara long before I let myself admit it out loud. On the way back through Nashville that time, Mara pointed out a building she used to walk past on her way to work, back before any of this, back before Derek and before the leaving, and before she ever set foot in that gas station 2 miles from my place. She didn't say much about it, just pointed. The way you point at something from an old life that doesn't sting anymore only reminds you how far you've actually come. I couldn't tell you the exact morning it all quietly turned into a life we shared, instead of two separate lives just running parallel to each other. There wasn't one clean line I could point back to and say, "There, that's the moment." But I remember waking up one ordinary day and seeing her camera sitting on the kitchen table right next to my truck keys, side by side, like they'd always belonged there together from the start, and I didn't find it strange at all. It just looked right. In a way, I finally stopped questioning altogether. I used to think that joke I made was just that, a joke, something I said with half a smile on my way to check a tire gauge, never once expecting anyone to actually take it seriously. Mara never saw it that way, not for a second. I understand now that she'd been standing in front of that particular door for a long time before I ever said the handful of words that happened to open it. I just didn't realize, back then, that I was the one holding the handle the whole time. That bronze suitcase sits in a closet now, past the hallway where her photographs still hang pinned along the wall, past the kitchen where 2 coffee cups sit out most mornings instead of just one. It doesn't travel between a rented room and the back of a cab anymore. It stayed, for good. And I think that's the truest way Mara ever told me something she never actually had to put into words at all. Some mornings I still catch myself standing in that hallway a little too long, looking at those photographs, thinking about how close I came to letting one conversation at a gas pump decide everything for us. I'm grateful, more than I know how to say out loud, that she drove out here that Sunday instead of just letting the silence between us win. Have you ever said something out loud as a joke that turned out, without you even realizing it at the time, to be the thing you wanted most in the world? And if that person really did show up the next morning at dawn, suitcase in hand, standing there ready to go, what would you have said back to her? If this story reached something in you, take a second and hit like, so Luke and Mara know they're not the only ones who felt exactly this. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story when it comes, and leave a comment down below telling me when you think Mara actually made up her mind to get on that truck that morning at dawn with the suitcase in her hand, or long, long before it.